I feel like we have this celebration and we understand that it's about the town and that the town owes a debt to the people who defended the First National Bank of Northfield on September 7th, 1876. And we definitely address that. And as a town, we have a unique understanding of our history and a unique respect for it. But I think we can still sometimes fail to fully appreciate the man at the center of it all. And that's Joseph Lee Heywood. Probably the most important thing that we as a community forget to really emphasize about Joseph Lee Heywood is that he was a hero way before the events of September 7th, 1876. Joseph Lee Heywood signed on with the 127th Illinois Infantry Regiment in 1862 during the Civil War. He was originally from Illinois and he moved to Minnesota only after the war. Joseph Lee Heywood quickly rose as a leader during his service with the Union Army. He actually was promoted to corporal. Corporals oversee a company of privates, so it means that he was a man who demonstrated to his fellow soldiers that he had some sort of leadership ability, that he had demonstrated some sort of courage and ability on the battlefield. And he had to put this to the test when he, his company, and the rest of the 127th fought in the Battle of Chickasaw Bayou, which was the opening engagement of the Vicksburg campaign. Now, the battle to take Vicksburg, Mississippi was one of the central battles of the Civil War, and one of the most important. Joseph Lee Heywood was a personal witness to some of the worst of the Civil War. When the Union Army won the Battle of Vicksburg, it was an enormous victory for the Union, for the United States, and it was an irreversible blow to the Confederate Army. And it was all thanks to the sacrifice of Joseph Lee Heywood and his fellow men. You know, I remember one story about a particular skirmish that Heywood was involved in. It was called the Battle for Arkansas Post. And it was a victory for the Union Army. But by the end of that day, one eyewitness said the battlefield was so strewn with the bodies of Union soldiers that it looked like someone had painted a streak of blue across the fields. And that's the scope of the devastation that Heywood witnessed in the Civil War. It was a tremendous amount of suffering for someone to experience personally and persevere through. After the Battle of Vicksburg, Heywood suffered through a series of just devastating diseases that left him on the verge of death for almost 2 years. But he persevered. He survived his horrific bouts with campground diseases. And although he was at one point let go from the Union Army because of his intense sickness, he actually re-enlisted after recovering from his bout with illness and served for the rest of the war as a medical assistant at an Army hospital, meaning that he was there on the scene to help his wounded veterans, fellow people suffering with horrific diseases acquired on the battlefield, and making sure that his fellow veterans got life-saving care that they desperately needed after suffering some of the worst of the Civil War. Thinking about Heywood's career in the Army overall, he had proven himself on the battlefield. He had risen to a position of leadership among his fellow men, and he had, after recovering from horrific diseases, he had devoted his time in the service to taking care of the sick and wounded. The James Younger Gang's origin was also during the Civil War. The James Younger Gang began as a group of what are called bushwhackers, essentially pro-slavery terrorists in Missouri and Kansas. After the Confederate Army was expelled from Missouri, pro-slavery forces still remained behind to commit wartime atrocities on civilian populations in the surrounding area. Bushwhackers, like the James Younger Gang, were pro-slavery terrorists who indiscriminately killed civilians and soldiers. This was the beginning for Frank James, Jesse James, and Cole Younger, who all met as bushwhackers during the Civil War. For example, Frank and Cole met as part of Quantrill's Raiders, who were a group of bushwhackers in Missouri. Both Frank and Cole participated in something called the Lawrence Massacre, when a group of these bushwhackers went into an anti-slavery city called Lawrence, Kansas, targeted for its affiliation with abolition and anti-slavery. Frank James and Cole Younger participated in this slaughter, going building by building and executing civilians, including children. Jesse James joined his brother's campaign of slaughter by participating in the Centralia Massacre, when a group of about 20 Union soldiers going home on leave from their service were captured, kidnapped, murdered, and scalped by the bushwhackers. The James Younger gang's origin was as a vehicle for murder in the service of slavery. After the Civil War, these terrorist groups continued to murder across Missouri and Kansas. With the Confederacy defeated, an anti-slavery group controlled Missouri's state politics. This new post-Civil War government began to pass what one historian called a comprehensive package of civil rights and education programs for people who had formerly been enslaved. For example, the state government of Missouri began advocating for complete voting rights for Black Americans after the Civil War. For former bushwhackers like Frank Jesse James and Cole Younger, this was unacceptable. Though a large amount of the bushwhackers returned to normal life after the war, the most committed to hatred and violence stuck together. These former Confederates violently resisted the program of civil rights after the Civil War. For example, former bushwhackers violently occupied the city of Lexington, Missouri on Election Day 1866 to prevent pro-civil rights candidates from being elected on a local office. This is the period when the James Younger gang forges its own identity. So they begin in this period with the suppression of Black voter rights and a violent resistance to civil rights legislation in Missouri state politics. But this group of people isn't satisfied with just interfering in elections and preventing the administration of local politics. This is the period in which the first daylight peacetime bank robberies take place. And it's no coincidence that the first takes place in Liberty, Missouri, and that although the identities of these robbers have never been confirmed, there's strong reason to believe that at least Frank and Jesse James were present. Core of people who begin as a large terrorist group during the Civil War, after Reconstruction are whittled down but still powerful, and throughout the post-Civil War years, eventually are whittled down to this group of the most committed, the most violent, and the most hateful. And these are the men who become the James Younger gang. They're the people most motivated by a base desire for domination over other people, service to white supremacy and desire for money, essentially. So they start robbing banks. And over the next decade, their all-consuming hatred leads to an unknown number of murders and dozens of bank robberies. So that's all something that's easy to lose in the spectacle of defeat days, and especially when you're down at the reenactment and the horses are running by and there's gunfire and shouting. And remember that the people who walk into the First National Bank a decade earlier were indiscriminately killing civilians and anti-slavery families. So I think we sort of forget that the confrontation between Frank James and Joseph Lee Heywood is not really a confrontation between a desperado and a martyr. I think it's a confrontation between a coward and a hero. And when Frank James walked into the First National Bank on September 7th, 1876, he was already a coward, and Joseph Lee Heywood was already a hero. And that's why the James Younger gang lost on September 7th, is that they didn't factor that into their calculations. All of this is why what happened on September 7th, 1876 happened. It's why Northfield was able to defeat the James Younger gang. Frank James was always a coward. That's why he slaughtered civilians, and that's why he shot down Joseph Lee Heywood. And Joseph Lee Heywood was always a hero. That's why he volunteered to defeat the Confederacy. That's why he volunteered to serve the sick and wounded during the war. And that's why he stood up to Frank James and saved our town. And all of this is why, 150 years later, Frank James still deserves contempt, and Joseph Lee Heywood still deserves our respect and our gratitude.